Hello, my name is Apoorv Asthana. I'm from Section B and my roll number is 64. I'll be taking you all through to the application of situational crisis communication theory on the famous Germanwings Flight 9525 accident that happened in 2015. The purpose of this video is to understand and measure the effectiveness of overall crisis communication response by Lufthansa Group according to the SCCT model. So before we begin, let's understand what really happened. This was March 24th in 2015, where an Airbus A320 operated by Germanwings Flight 9525 that headed from Barcelona and Dusseldorf crashed into the French Alps. This was about 11 a.m. Local time, where it had about 150 passengers on board who died suddenly in the accident. This was one of the biggest accidents that could ever happen in the history of airlines. Uh, Lufthansa was the parent company for the Germanwings flight. Lufthansa, being such a big name, which boasted a lot about their safety, had a lot of crisis at hand, wherein they had to deal with a lot of press, media, and primary, secondary, and additional stakeholders that were at play. We'll look into all that in the video further. So to understand what really happened, so let's kind of understand what the SCCT model has to offer. So SCCT model is by Coombs and Holiday, which consists of two core elements, namely the crisis situation and the crisis response strategies. We'll put them in the considering the case that we have, we put all of both of them in these two buckets. SCCT is primarily an attempt to evaluate the reputational threat posed by the crisis situation and then recommends crisis response strategies based upon the reputational threat level, and more on understanding how to protect reputational assets during a crisis. Um, Moving forward, SECT clustered are they have primarily three clusters where we can put different types of crisis in it. It's first is victim cluster, accident cluster, and then the third is preventable cluster. If we look into it, victim cluster involves a lot of national disaster, rumor, workplace violence, product tampering, which has a lot of minimal attribution of crisis responsibility and requires minor reputational threat, wherein an accidental cluster involves challenges, technical error accident, technical error product harm, wherein there's a moderate attribution of crisis responsibility and require a moderate reputational threat. Then comes the preventable cluster, wherein there's a human error accident, human error product harm, organizational misdeed with no injuries, organizational misdeed, management misconduct. Uh, and this comes with a lot of strong attribution of crisis responsibility and requires severe reputational threat. We primarily we'll get into the content and the kind of PR and the press release that the company and the stakeholders did, but this was primarily a lot to do with the preventable cluster. So first let's understand what kind of keeping the case in play. Let's understand what kind of stakeholders we really have here. So we can put them into three buckets. That is the primary stakeholder, the secondary stakeholder, and the additional stakeholder. The primary stakeholders had investors, Ministry of Transport and Digital Infrastructure, Civil Aviation Authority, European Aviation Safety Agencies, employees, customers, suppliers, wherein the secondary stakeholders were the press, media, special interest groups, competitors, and then the additional stakeholders were the victims or the passengers and crew on board. Everyone had different responses to the accident that happened, and based on that, there were different types of crisis response that the whole situation was put into. But let's talk about what. So, for example, when we talk about primary stakeholders, for example, Ministry of Transport and Digital Infrastructure stated that, according to the current knowledge, we assume that the captain was actively barred from accessing the cockpit. These are the kind of the case facts that we had. So, basis these things, primarily from the stakeholder point of view, it was stated that this was more to do with a human error accident, and it was clubbed into the preventable cluster. It was an organizational misdeed with injuries. There were a lot of press releases, interviews from the victims, the board, the parent company, all of that, which kind of hinted that there was a lot of misjudgment in terms of recruitment of the pilot. uh, it was established that it was a deliberate attempt to for the plane crash. It came under the preventable cluster. When we so therefore, since this was into the preventable cluster, the reputational threat of crisis was a lot of strong attribution of crisis responsibility and required a severe reputational threat. Uh, Post these things, Germanwings and Lufthansa was very quick in addressing the whole issue and the crisis. They had a PR and press release right after the incident happened. The CEO of Germanwings, Winkelmann, went and visited the site where the crash happened. Post that, there was a lot of press releases, and primarily the response that Germanwings and Lufthansa had, basis the response strategies of the SCCT model, was basically rebuild crisis response strategy, and from the secondary aspect, it was bouldering crisis response strategy. Uh, so when we talk about building rebuild crisis response strategy, there was a lot of compensation involved, where they say that the families of the victims will be given free airline transportation to Marseille, nearest place to the crash site. Then there was a lot of apology involved. And from the secondary crisis strategy, there was a lot of bolstering. There was a lot of reminder about Lufthansa is all about safety. We consider safety is first for our passengers. This is a one-off case. Then there was a lot of victimage strategy at play, wherein they kept saying that this is one of the biggest crisis. This is one of the biggest thing that has ever happened in the history of Lufthansa and Germanwings. So these were the strategies adopted by Germanwings and Lufthansa. When we kind of delve deeper into it, we say that there were several when we do the content analysis in several different sources. There were like about two press releases, two press conferences, one online video broadcast that the CEO did. Basis that, there was about 36% of rebuild cluster that was used in the response strategies, and about 64% of the bolstering strategy that I just talked about. When we kind of still kind of dig deeper and understand the rebuild strategy, apology in the rebuild strategy was used a lot, in about the basis the statements that they had three times, 3 to 4 times. Then about in the bolstering strategy, victimage was what was emphasized a lot. It was about 4 to 5 times in the bolstering strategy that it was involved in the press conference and the press releases. Overall, the crisis situation was handled nicely by Lufthansa and Germanwings, and basis the SCCT model as well, the recommendation was it should have been a rebuild crisis response strategy and a bolstering strategy, crisis strategy, that should have been applied, which was primarily applied by Lufthansa and Germanwings. Um, so that's about that. This is how situational crisis communication theory is used in of an incident of such magnitude wherein lives are involved, and this is how crisis communication is primarily done. Crisis communication is one of the very important aspect where to understand. In fact, the SCCT model is very important to understand when we're in such a situation where we don't know what has to be done. So this was a very important learning in terms of how crisis communication is done. Thank you.